You're in the hands of an adolescent.
Mystery. I don't like mysteries. You're bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. This is episode 39 with your favorite gang, Lord Uther, Detective Nick Conklin, and UrzaMaster. Here we are. We are nearly 40 episodes deep, and we have finally reached what may be the apex of season 1 of the original series, Star Trek. So, I don't know if there's any way to really bring these episodes in. They are both delightful. And as always, we have some wonderful background here with our friend APC. So, Detective Conklin, bring us in.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to all of you on a 5-year mission to seek out strange new worlds. These are two exceptional episodes in different ways. And I know we're going to spend time talking about our second episode quite a bit because it had a outsized influence on Star Trek going forward throughout the years and continues to leave an impact today. But we should not overlook the contributions of The Return of the Archons, which aired on February 9th, 1967. It was directed by one of our returning champions, Joseph Pevney, who, along with Mark Daniels, is tied for directing the most episodes of the original series at 14. And if Mark Daniels sounds familiar, just wait about 20 minutes and you will see why. The story for this episode was credited to Gene Roddenberry himself, and the actual screenplay was assigned to Boris Sobelman. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of The Return of the Archons, and there were several, I thought we'd take a moment and set the scene, what was then present day, for 1967 for our audiences, because we get to sit here and look back across the space-time continuum from our lofty perch in 2023, and we see things from a modern perspective. But what were people and audiences experiencing back in 1967 when this show was airing? For example, a first-class stamp was a nickel. Stamps are things that they put on letters, and to our younger audiences, Google that, and you'll be able to see how communications were once passed back and forth between locations. A gallon of gas...
IRL, if you will.
There you go. A gallon of gas was 33 cents, and that was with inflation. A movie ticket was $1.25, and if you were standing in line at the movies for $1.25, you were seeing things like The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, In the Heat of the Night. So it was a big year for Sidney Poitier that year. The federal minimum wage was $1.40 an hour, and it hasn't got much better since 1967. Lyndon Baines Johnson was president. The Vietnam War was raging. Congress created the Public Broadcasting System, PBS, which, as we all know, is the home of Sesame Street, and great fireworks displays on the 4th of July. The first Super Bowl was played in 1967. It was the Packers of Green Bay over the Chiefs of Kansas City. Final score, Packers 35, Chiefs 10, played in the Los Angeles Coliseum, which is now home to the USC Trojans, and former home of the Los Angeles Raiders, who are now in Las Vegas. Doritos were first sold in 1967, but not the Doritos you've grown up with, and certainly not the plethora of flavors available now. No, they were just corn chips, heavily salted, but no flavoring. You would not get nacho cheese Doritos until the year of Lord Uther and mine's birth, 1972. And you wouldn't get an exciting second variety, only a second variety of Doritos, until 1986 with Cool Ranch. Now,
Cool Ranch. There we go.
there's literally 50 varieties of Doritos. There's even potato chips masquerading as Doritos. I went in the other day and saw a Lay's potato chip that was branded with nacho cheese and Cool Ranch flavorings. And I thought to myself, why do I want a potato chip that tastes like a Dorito when I could just get the Dorito? But I digress. It was also the first issue of Rolling Stone, the magazine, which used to be relevant and used to be at your supermarkets. And Aretha Franklin released arguably her number one single, RESPECT. And you should find out what that means to me. So amidst all of that, that's the context in which we are getting these delightful episodes of first season Trek. In this show itself, we have one of our first references to the Prime Directive, and that'll be explored in further episodes down the line, but the first actual vocalization and acknowledgement of said directive. And modern filmmakers and creatives have taken inspiration for a sequence in this film, I kid you not, for the film series and television show The Purge. So while that was a clumsy B movie, politicized dreck, and that's from my humble opinion, they did take their inspiration from the riot scene here in this episode, which is kind of a good place to start with Return of the Archons, because as a writer watching this particular episode, it's really kind of all over the place. It's a salad bar of ideas that never quite coalesces into a satisfying whole. But boy, there are some wonderful things about it, and any one of them could have spun off into their own narrative thread. We have the Red Hour. And in fact, one of the modern filmmakers inspired by this was Ben Stiller. He named his production company Red Hour after the sequence in this episode because it left such an impression on him as a young boy when he saw it. But basically the idea that from sunup or from sundown to sunup, anything goes. Sexual freedom, violence, vandalism, high insurance rates. It's just all goes out the window. And then as soon as the clock strikes 6, everyone just gets back to work. And someone has to start sweeping up all those damaged windows and broken doors. But as quickly as they establish that, we never see it again. And there's little explanation beyond what we see, on the screen. The episode's not really about the riot. It's just this offshoot of this strange tyrannical society run by artificial intelligence, ripped from tomorrow's headlines. So you have that idea. You have what is always, and this is the first time I had viewed this episode, but I discovered how much it had subliminally influenced my dreams without me knowing it. Because I have often written about or dreamed of robed figures operating in the shadows, stalking you. It was an image that I did pick up early on in young Sherlock Holmes. And just this idea of men and women whose faces are cloaked, doing evil deeds or being ominous harbingers. I loved it. Even in broad daylight, they're creepy, as they're menacing Sulu in the opening moments of this episode. Then we had, and they also gave off a very Prince of Darkness, John Carpenter vibe, as our crew find themselves in the streets and the townspeople suddenly start picking up blunt objects to beat them with them. And if you're familiar with the 87 horror classic from Mr. Carpenter, that also used very similar imagery in spaces. So there's a lot of really cool, exciting things going on here. The overall messaging of this episode is where it's come up for debate. Is this an attack on organized religion? Is this championing? We're in the point of the 60s. We've got, the social revolutions. We've got the sexual revolution. We've got people protesting the Vietnam War. Is this an anti-reactionary reaction to what some people might eschew is chaos in the streets? The kids are running around, growing out their hair and smoking weed and, fornicating. Was this idea of the supercomputer establishing order, was that something that Star Trek and the Roddenberry, who again wrote the story, were they saying we endorse this vision, we reject this vision, and we want to embrace the wild side? And we'll leave that to our fellow Trekkies here to debate amongst themselves. How did you read sort of the behind the scenes of the context of what they're trying to say here? Is the purge sequence something that we should abhor and run away from, obviously, because it involved violence, destruction of property, and assault and all of those things? But was the answer then just this absorption of personality and bending to the will? It came off with the crew sort of saying, we are one with the body, we are one, you are not of the body. It came off a little bit like Diet Cybok, taking away people's personalities and sort of brainwashing them into this, blissfully smiling, Sulu has that grin, a euphoric brainwashing. So anyways, a lot to stir the pot here. So take it away, UrzaMaster. Where you think Roddenberry was trying to steer us with this, and did he hit his target?
I think that's the beauty of the episode. He was not, and that's, I think, the biggest intent behind it is that he's posing the question. We bring the rudder to the seas. He's showing us that there are options with which to create a utopia, which is often veiled or masked as a dystopia, and vice versa. It's a utopian vision where everyone seems to be pleasant and getting along, but they seem empty and different somehow, only to uncover that this is some sort of dystopian vision. And it's the idea of the pleasure machine. It's a very, very, ancient parable that is really just presented in a way that it does take on organized religion, but it also takes on the lack thereof. And it also confronts you with fascism versus potentially a capitalistic society, or communism versus capitalism. It presents all of these things wrapped up in a bow. And it's what you bring to it that you must then unpack. You have to understand that if you were removing some of the freedoms of these people, the individuality of these people, it can make for a very peaceful, very continuous society that lacks a lot of the strife or challenges of modern society or what have you. And vice versa. You can see that it removes the humanity and imposes machinery, because it itself is a machine. And that's how you arrive at this. It's sort of like that godlike being that we keep seeing, but instead of a flawed sort of Greek god type character, as we get with Trelane and some of the other, Charlie X type characters, this is a much more modernist viewpoint, which is kind of a segue between the flawed Greek gods who try to control the world to the sort of machinations we get with later science fiction like the Terminator or War Games or something like of that nature. It's a very cool bridge between the two, because Star Trek itself is a utopian vision of the future, but it's full of flaws and inherent struggles and strife. And the one thing the original series doesn't really show a lot of at this point is the, conflict that still exists even in this exploratory future where, yeah, the aliens you've never met before and the worlds you're charting, which are undiscovered yet, of course there's going to be strife there. That's assumed, right? But what we don't see thus far, aside from a short brush with the Romulans, is the ongoing struggles of intergalactic politics, and that's something that later generations of Star Trek leans more heavily into. But the art behind this is really the fact that it's meant to make you think more than it's meant to give you conclusions. At no point does this episode suggest to you that, like, this is your answer. This is, yes, you shouldn't do this if you want a, utopian future, and or you should remove this to avoid dystopia. It's very much is it possible to achieve a universally peaceful culture? Is it logical? Is it desirable? And vice versa. Does it merit control to achieve this, or is it achievable through other means? This is really, it should be critical thinking en masse, taught in schools kind of thing, because you have to divorce what you bring to the episode to properly analyze it, but you're inextricable when it comes to your analysis, because no matter how you look at this episode, there's no way to really purify what's being presented either, because it is so representative. And that's what makes Star Trek as a whole quite timeless, is so many of these episodes apply at any given point in human history because it's so archetypal. And it's such an interesting and provocative view of what could be, and so very closely related to what is.
Because it seems like it kind of rejects both roads. It suggests there must be a third path forward, because you have the rioting, which is abhorrent, but then you have a supercomputer stripping away all personality, which is equally bad, which is why they confront it. So, like I say, the episode
and a
doesn't
secret
sit
police.
there. Right, and a secret police, thought police, and
resistance.
So it really rejects both extremes, I suppose. But I wasn't quite clear, even at the very end, if they were espousing like a more centrist viewpoint, or if one was able to walk that fine line again between anarchy and authoritarianism.
Oh, now I get to go now.
Yes.
Yes. I would like a future with no head colds, but maybe Star Trek can solve that problem. Because I'm on 7 weeks of this. But anyway, I do think I think there is a message here, and I'm going to even jump ahead because there's going to be a couple other episodes like this, and I actually think he's done it before. It doesn't matter how great the computer is or how great the technology is. James T. Kirk will outsmart it every single time. And I think what Roddenberry is constantly getting at is that you need the human flaws in order to get to that vision of not perfection, but can't we all just get along, right? Like the computer can't solve the problem. And
something better.
Yeah. I think you need human, like you need our faults, right? And it's funny because this episode and a couple other episodes right now in our current state, we're heading down a path where we're leaning more and more on computers and AI, supposedly in the next, 5 years, AI is going to be sentient, like all these things that are going on. But you still need the piece of humanity to kind of make it what it is, or to survive. Like this computer had been around for like 6,000 years, and it still wasn't working for their society. Like it just didn't work. You needed the humanity piece. So I kind of think there is a message there. I think it's that. And like you mentioned about flaws, it's like it's got to be a part of humanity. It's got to be a part of what allows us to move forward and survive and be who we are. So it's kind of like, I think it's one of those, like, don't wish too much for something to kind of happen or to be, because what you wish for is not always what it seems or what it's going to turn out to be too.
And it's the creative impulse too. The creative human mind grows very much from the dark side of the senses. Like, that's what for those who are fans of the Matrix, what they did so beautifully in that movie is that, without the chaos of humanity, the machines couldn't survive. What powered them was not necessarily the heat, the electricity that they generated, but the utter chaos. The fact that they couldn't make a utopian Matrix. The first Matrix failed because it was too perfect. There had to be misery. There had to be these dark elements. Otherwise, humanity rejects it. And it's the pleasure machine, again, in a different sense, but you would never recognize that you are content or happy or experiencing pleasure if you had nothing to compare it to. If you only experience constant pleasure, it would be empty. There would be no reward to it. So that's, the highs and lows of human existence are completely hinged upon our ability to feel both good and bad.
Well, and I think there's that quote, and I think it can be applied multiple ways. You can't have the bad without the good. You can't have the good without the bad, or the bad without the good. Either one. Like, you need those things to kind of find balance. I think about when I was working 3 jobs at one point. The benefit was we had a whole lot of income coming in that was beyond what we would usually have. But the bad was I wasn't around. I was always working. I was always exhausted. I mean, Urza, I was always exhausted. Like, there's things that go along with that. And I think that's that chaos that you kind of talk about. We would become, and I was having this conversation with my students the other day about, we were talking about money and, the billions that Jordan has and the billions that Elon Musk has. And like, at what point do you become desensitized and totally forget what it's like to almost be human in a sense, or to have problems? And those are the things that got us there. Like Joe Rogan talks a lot about, all those tough times make you better in the long run. All those things you struggle through, like, that's part of humanity. And if you never have that, where would you be? And it's almost like this episode kind of takes you there in a sense.
Yeah. Very, very brilliantly, artfully portrayed. Although there were some goofy moments too. Do we ever find out what happens to the crewman in the beginning that runs away from Sulu? I don't think we do. I think they just sort of drop him in the episode. They're like, Sulu gets beamed back to the Enterprise. Where's the other guy? I don't know. And then we never find out. They just leave him. They're just like, what? F that guy, It
was a very, you're right. It was a very clunky, almost hodgepodgey type episode that just didn't, well, obviously you're going to kind of tell where my rating's going to go for this one. It just didn't flow very well. I struggled with this episode. I get all the deep points to it, but I just struggle with how clunky it was.
I think structure-wise, you're right, because you start off with a very strong sequence. Well, first you start off with Sulu in danger, then you have the riot, and that obviously grabs your attention, and then suddenly we've got the imprisonment of the crew, and we've got Bones on the dark side, and then we've got, and it just kind of goes from point to point, and as you say, some of those connective threads may seem a bit thinner than normal. So there may have been some behind the scenes stuff, some rewriting, some, there. But strong performances from our big three in all three, starting with DeForest Kelley, who, plays a convincing bad guy, if you will. Like, again, we've talked about how it's a little uncomfortable seeing him flirty, but it's even more uncomfortable to see him basically pulling a Donald Sutherland Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You're not of the body, like they do in the 1978 remake of the classic science fiction thriller. So he did a great job. I thought Spock, Leonard Nimoy, keeping his cool in captivity and bluffing that he was converted. And so forth, and offering, good advice with Kirk. They're plotting overnight while the purge is going on, what their next moves are. And Kirk, obviously, it's Jim Kirk. But I love the line when they take shelter from the riot and he meets the 3 townspeople and he's like, hi, we didn't expect that kind of welcome. And it's just delivered in such a wry off, and it was just perfect. Kirk is strapped to the whatever they called the machine that made them of the body. It looked like a bad James Bond trap. And that's just the nature of the 60s. Just chain them to the wall. And it's interesting that they had this supercomputer who was sentient and was calling all the shots. This was 1 year before Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece 2001: A Space Odyssey would hit theaters, presumably still for $1.25 ticket. And HAL 9000 came to represent the unspoken fear at the time that unbridled technology run amok would be the end of us all. And they've been beating that drum consistently for the last 50 years. I get it. But it is interesting that this does predate what people would later just say is the grandfather of computer villains and so forth there.
It's interesting, too, to point out that you get what feels like the Star Trek movies level of chemistry between the big three. And I think I'm fairly certain it was this episode where Kirk says to Spock, "Mr. Spock, you'd make an excellent computer." And Spock's like, "Thank you, sir." Like, yes. Just astonished. And it's like, wow, that's really like modern, like Kirk, Spock, McCoy type chemistry. And just the balance of emotion and logic. And yet Kirk errs more on the logical side in this episode, which is unlike him, but then ultimately leans back to emotion to defeat, the computer at the end, which, I mean, it plays really well. I would agree that the structure of this episode is certainly a little bit lacking. It feels like the script was probably doubly as long. Like they had a lot they wanted to get into with it, especially with the daughter, maybe making her character a love interest for Kirk, and instead they're like, we don't have time to do that. I feel like if this script would have been made into a movie, it would have been far more successful. If you had double the screen time, you really could have gone into some of the nuance of, especially the fact that the crew gets captured and essentially loses. Like they lose their first big confrontation, which I don't think has happened at this point in the series. They've gotten into some scuffs, but this is the first time it's like, oof, they could really lose this one. And of course they're not going to, but at the time you had no idea. Like, how do they come back for this? They also don't explain how everybody comes back from this. Like, how does Sulu and Bones get their minds back? Like, if their individuality was removed from them, and was it saved in this computer or was it deleted? Like, we really don't get answers to that. And it's like, we know they're under a deep form of control, but does that control really erase them per se? Or
I thought it was like a computer telekinesis kind of thing that they were under, but again, I could be wrong. That's the problem. Like you're saying, that's the problem with the episode. There's no, like, the clarity just isn't there. It's just they threw stuff at a wall, and whatever kind of stuck they went with. They
hit him with a truth bomb, and that snapped that euphoria right there. So, but in any event, if Return of the Archons is an appetizer, then we are here to feast on the main course. Like I say, there's no more notable first season episode in terms of its reach and legacy than what aired on February 16th, 1967, and that would be Space Seed. The director is our other returning champion, Mark Daniels. The story was by Kerry Wilbur, and the script was written by producer Gene L. Kuhn, showrunner, and Kerry Wilbur. Now, apparently Roddenberry tried to claim credit for working on the script, and the WGA at the time said no. So he was frozen out of the, apparently he did some rewrites, worked on it, but didn't do enough to warrant the credit, and it was given to Kuhn and Wilbur. Khan Noonien Singh was originally Nordic, and then they cast Ricardo Montalban, and he just ran with it, friends. Yep, he just absolutely ran with it. Even just watching him sitting frozen in cryostasis, like there's a presence there. And I think we can arguably, the three of us could arguably agree or disagree. It's the first overwhelming show of personality on the bad guy's side in this season. I mean, we've had some good turns. You know, we've had our Trelanes and we've had our Harry Mudds and our Charlie X's. I mean, but like, especially knowing where this journey will end later in 1982, to see Khan and to see his cruelty and his arrogance and so forth. It's just like, this again was my first viewing of this, and I had long since experienced the sequel, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, again 1982, and I get it. I understand why when Paramount wanted to do a sequel to the motion picture, and they approached television producer Harv Bennett with what his ideas were. He had never seen a Star Trek episode, so he spent a weekend watching as many as he could at home and came back and said, let's do this, and held up Space Seed as his example, because he felt that the one thing that the motion picture probably lacked was a really strong villain, and that the idea of V'ger, while, you know, cerebrally exciting and loaded with possibilities intellectually and morally, that this was, they needed an actual opponent. Now, this episode actually went $80,000 over budget, and they needed 5 costumes for Khan in the episode, including that weird fishnet one he starts off in. And that was more than any other guest star that ever appeared on the show. So if there's any wardrobe credits at the end, there might be a special assistant to Ricardo Montalban on this one. We should also point out Madeline Rue playing Lieutenant MacGyvers, who is referenced in The Wrath of Khan, but alas, perished at the hands of some native parasites. And a lot of this initial excitement for me was listening for the signposts and Easter eggs that would lead me to Wrath of Khan. So they referenced the City Alpha star system. You know, this is City Alpha 5. So that was exciting to hear. This was the very first time I had ever seen the Botany Bay. Like in the film, it was cargo holds with a seatbelt that Chekhov recognized. And we're not going to get into the whole where was Chekhov and all of this. That's been debated ad nauseum. He was on the night shift, according to the novelization. So he was there. We just didn't see him. They referenced the mid-1990s, the eugenics war. In fact, they said that basically all this damage occurred from 1992 to 1996, which were my exact years at the University of Southern California. And that explains a lot, actually.
Oh, you beat me to it.
That society went to hell, basically when I was an undergraduate at the film school. So there it is. The thing that strikes that I kind of want to take it to here first, because you guys had seen this obviously well before I had experienced it, and as well as the feature film. Khan interacts with virtually all our main crew members. He holds a knife and his fist to Bones' throat and interacts with them. In fact, Bones tells him to choose, either choke me or cut my throat, but pick a lane. He verbally jousts with Spock at dinner in a scene that has echoes later on of The Undiscovered Country, when they're looks like a nice, pleasant get-together, but in reality, we want to pick up the cutlery and start slicing. He beats down poor Montgomery Scott, who the network by this point realized that James Doohan was hot, as were the Beatles. So they started demanding more screen time for Scotty. And so suddenly he's going on away missions more, and he's becoming a much more visible part of the ship. In the previous episode, they put him on the bridge while everybody else was down on the planet imprisoned. So a lot of Scott is coming forward here. But what's fascinating to me, and hopefully you guys have your own takes on this, the film, the sequel, where Khan escapes his banishment and comes to take his vengeance out on the man who maroons him there and for the death of his wife. The film really, the writers that Harv Bennett and Jack B. Sowards, when they went to do the sequel to this episode, they made it a one-on-one, right? They made it Moby Dick. They made it Ahab and the White Whale. Like none of the other crew, even though they're present, right? McCoy's with him, Spock's with him, Scotty's with him. There's no meaningful contact between them and Khan in the film. And in fact, it might have been the nature of how the film was created, where Montalban and Shatner never shared a scene together. They never acted together. I mean, we're not even talking like, the drawbacks of 1982 technology at the time. Their schedules didn't work at all. So Montalban delivered all of his lines in The Wrath of Khan to a set girl, onto a blank wall, and had a set girl reading lines. So he never even got to bounce off Shatner's performance. And it's a miracle / amazing bit of acting that they seem so convincingly to hate each other and be such vicious rivals in this picture without ever once exchanging an on-set hello or a face-to-face viewing. But like I say, the film telescopes it down so minutely to Khan versus Kirk. And it was fascinating to watch this episode. By contrast, he's ticking everybody off and like having these great interactions with the rest of the crew. And so I was both like excited to see those interactions, but I was also now in retrospect feeling slightly let down because there was such a narrow telescoped, point of view in the film. Like it's not a missed opportunity. And I don't think it takes a centimeter's worth of value from Star Trek II. Star Trek II is a fantastic motion picture, but it was jarring, I guess. I wasn't used to seeing like McCoy and Khan and Spock and Khan and Scotty and Khan. Like it just, and so that was my first point of thought, was the he basically antagonizes the crew in the episode, and in the movie makes it a very one-on-one, I will hunt you down. So your thoughts on as you're enjoying and experiencing that, if that's something that even occurred to you guys.
I always thought it was a little strange that you don't get a face-to-face between Kirk and Khan, but that was kind of the play of the age, right? Khan, despite the fact that he had aged significantly, was still sort of this like peak physical specimen. And Kirk, by contrast, was supposed to play like the sort of scrappy old man, right? The underdog, which in this episode, I think, played very differently. Kirk came across as more brazen and young and prepared and knowledgeable and really the equal of Khan in a lot of ways. Even in their fight scene, he gets the best of Khan. But he gets that way because he's crafty. And that to me has always stuck out as one of the most interesting bits about this, because when you think of Kirk versus Khan in Star Trek II, it's way more of a team effort to defeat Khan, whereas Khan is virtually single-handedly stopped by Kirk in this episode. Even Spock gets the best, gets bested by Khan in some ways. And that to me, like, really sticks out as interesting. And that's why I love this paired with Star Trek II, because you get sort of the, how do we want to put it? The journey of time for Kirk's character specifically. I think it would have been interesting to see scenes that they could have shared together, but it really made it more of a space battle movie, which is, again, something you didn't really get in the motion picture. And echoes later in Star Trek 6, and even somewhat in Star Trek 3, in ways that, I don't know, it keeps it fresh for me. Like it doesn't give you everything you want, but it gives you just enough. And that's something that I think, a Hollywood movie these days, especially a Star Trek movie, can't get away with. You have to have kind of a balance of everything. You can't get this very cerebral, shall we say, non-combative force like a motion picture. It didn't really work back then, but it certainly worked better then than it does these days. And that's why Star Trek II was such a smash hit, because it was far more accessible, really. I think that's why Star Trek V also wasn't as successful. It didn't really have a very central villain. When we kind of find out that Cybok really isn't a villain, and God is, like, it's a little bit more hard for. It's kind of like getting Space Seed in the Return of the Archons in reverse. Like it's harder for the audience to digest and accept. I think Space Seed is kind of that same way to Wrath of Khan. Like, yes, Khan is absolutely a villain in this, but he's almost like bested and kind of resigned to his fate, which never, even at the conclusion of the episode, never quite sits well. Like, you sort of know, like, this feels like a decision that's going to come back to haunt Kirk. And without Wrath of Khan, which I think had the series gone on longer, we may have seen a return of Khan in some manner. But without Wrath of Khan, it would have felt very incomplete. So it's that two-parter thing again. Like, if you watch Space Seed without watching the Wrath of Khan, you may feel a little let down by this episode. But knowing what we know about Star Trek II, I think it makes it far more special an event in Star Trek canon.
Where do I begin? UrzaMaster and I were talking about this the other night when we were doing our live stream, which all of you should tune into and turn into as well. Maybe you turn into us as you're tuning into us. So we want to click subscribe, as always, so you get those notifications of when we go live, which we're talking about doing again this weekend. So join us, won't you? Now, here's why this works. I mean, not even God, like you said, UrzaMaster, not even God could keep up with James T. Kirk. But Khan, look, you've got two actors. You couldn't have paired two actors together better to play off each other, because they're the exact same gosh darn thing. You had Ricardo Montalban, who was all nice and cut. And like, there's that one scene where he's like doing some cheese stuff and he goes like this and his pecs are all pectorally and everything, right? And he's all nice and like smooth and tan and everything. He's the total, like he's Kirk. He's Spock. Like we said, he verbally goes and mentally kind of spars with Spock a little bit, which, if you think about Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, Spock admires Khan's intellect. Tell me another time that Spock has said something like admired an intellect like that. It just said how much of a genius he is as well. So to me, I feel, I do agree with you that it's a team effort in Wrath of Khan, but I still think here and there there's, well, maybe more so with Spock at least. Spock is kind of interacting with Khan, but again, on a different level, right? That admiration from Space Seed still carries over. Noting his intelligence. And then, of course, Spock, being the better, figures out the way Khan thinks, two-dimensionally, blah, blah, blah. We know the result. But you have these two characters and these two actors that are just the perfect foils for each other. They're perfect. It couldn't have been any better. And to me, it's almost in the same realm as Vader and Luke, like the two perfect guys to go against each other. And we have it here with Kirk and Khan. There's a line at the end of Space Seed where I think it was Spock who said, I would like to come back and see them like 100 years from now and see what they're like. And I felt like they were, like, to your point, they were setting up possibly a future episode where they were going to go back there and kind of see what was going on. And obviously we get it with Wrath of Khan. But this episode, I also feel like it's the first episode too where it's not a computer that's trying to best the entire crew. It's just someone, it's just not an everyday person, but at least it's a human who has that, you know, those genetics or the superior intellect or whatever they were calling it, that was able to give the crew a tough time. One more thing, there, Detective Conklin. It's funny you bring that up about Scotty, because I believe in future episodes, every time Kirk and Spock leave the ship, he's taking the captain's chair, where it probably really should have been, it should have been Sulu. I think that should have actually been in the chair, but it winds up being Scotty and almost everything going forward. Like they put him on the bridge, to your point, almost on purpose, right?
Interesting. Interesting.
So that must play into the background you have there. This episode is, it's everything that makes Star Trek beautiful, because one last point, just because Khan is to Kirk as Q is to Picard. It's two different things. It's two different types of strengths and weaknesses, but the perfect foil. This is why Q is so beautiful. He's the perfect foil. He didn't show up all the time. He was always just messing with Picard, who always tried to be serious and see things differently. That's the beauty of these two quote unquote villains going against two of the best captains ever.
This is the first episode that I'm aware of that Bones complains about transporters scattering atoms. So this was the first of what I presume will be several references, culminating with the motion picture when he did it.
Where he shows up in a 70 discos outfit on the, when he gets beamed up,
and a full beard,
the big medallion.
In a weird, just because I'm hearing it in retrospect rather than hearing it in '67, the score does have a few James Horner-esque beats in it, which obviously he must have subconsciously or consciously appropriated for his rousing score to Star Trek II. So I was pleased to hear those little musical motifs going in there. Like Khan, like his seduction and domination of MacGyver's, they don't have an hour's worth of material that they can convince audiences that she would betray the crew or side with him or join him even. They have very limited runway in which to present that, and they still do it. They do it in two scenes, basically. He inspects her cabin, sees that she's a historian, you know, with historical figures from Napoleon and so forth. And he says, well, such men dare take what they want. And, you know, please sit and entertain me. And says, you'd look so much prettier with your hair. Like all of this manipulation and all of that. And then basically, you know, causing her to bend the knee. You know, by the time they reach dinner, she's in. And then kind of reverses it when they're trying to asphyxiate Kirk and freeze him long enough to give the ship a fighting chance. But yeah, after, and then to strike Uhura, I mean, not once, but twice. Like, I'm not a fan of knocking around Nichelle Nichols. And I felt real like, you know, I wanted to get out of my seat and hit that guy. You know, how dare you hit Uhura? You know, that was a tough moment there. And I mean, he outsmarts them. He suffocates them on the bridge, you know, takes them prisoner, puts Kirk, you know, unlike being strapped to the wall in a bad James Bond trap in the previous episode, here, again, there's real jeopardy. He's going to, you know, turn into a asphyxiated husk if MacGyver's doesn't intervene. And all of that, and your fight sequence, and your stunt doubles going at it, and crushing phasers with bare hands. The hearing, you know, everyone in their formal gowns and ringing the bell and so forth. I get it. And it's almost as if, again, that, you know, Kirk shows mercy. He could take Khan and his people to the nearest starbase and, you know, turn them in, you know, these are criminals from Earth's past, and, you know, we'll put them in the Phantom Zone, or, you know, let Starfleet Academy or Starfleet Intelligence deal with them. But he gives them a choice. He's like, you want to rule? We'll find you a place where you can build your own civilization and just stay out of the galaxy's way. And Khan, reasoning that that's better than another life of imprisonment, says, okay, fine. And that's how they end up on. But the whole idea of just sort of pronouncing judgment like that in a formal setting where there's a record, presumably, I don't know. I feel like, if I'd had the honor of writing it, maybe that's a conversation between Kirk and Khan in the brig or something. And he says, I'll set your people down somewhere. Like, there was something oddly like, and Khan, it took a little air out of the balloon in the sense that this guy tried to kill you and steal your ship. And, everyone's just doing this very formal judiciary process.
Well, I think it's, to your point, I think it's very interesting that he even gives in to them like that. I mean, what was the motivation for giving him a place to rule? I mean, like, obviously we're setting it up for something. I think you're right there, Detective Conklin. They could have done it a little differently in terms of giving him his own place, but it almost made it too convenient to set up either a sequel episode or something. And if I'm Starfleet and I hear that one of the most notorious, whatever you want to call it, from the 90s that caused all this chaos, they gave him his own planet to land on and try and kind of rule over, that just seemed a little much. I mean,
well, it was just such a letdown when you have this great villain who's done everything he can to wreck the Enterprise and Kirk. Like I say, Kirk takes the high road. So I don't want to question the motives, and I don't think it detracts from the episode, but it does tonally for me at the very end. I'm like, all right, I get it, and I know where this is going, but I wanted it to be a little bit more like a side deal. Here's the elevator pitch. Khan says to Kirk, I will get free, and I will break you, Jim Kirk, and Kirk's like, no, I'm gonna maroon you on a barren planet, buried alive, kind of like, and puts a little knife into Khan, and he's like, we have not heard the last of me, James Kirk. I'm just something a little more adversarial. Right. This one felt a little more like a negotiated peace, and so that's my.
No, I just like that idea better, that it's not in such a formal setting like what you're saying, where it's, again, like it's a side deal. It's something off to the side. And then Kirk, maybe he goes and he doctors his logs or does something, right? He does the justification piece of kind of giving it a line of baloney as to why he put him down on a planet. Yeah, that would have played out so well.
Con who?
Anytime you want, Paramount, the three of us are available. I mean, just go ahead and click on subscribe below, Paramount, and we'll come on in and we'll give you some help on any future episodes that you may have.
You got it. Well, I think that rounds us out to our ratings of The Return of the Archons and Space Seed. Now, these are two pretty formidable episodes for Star Trek. So, Nick Conklin, let's hear it. What do you rate these?
Well, I've listened to our carefully crafted analysis and critiques of Return of the Archons, and I'm going to uplift a little. I think I came in with a number in mind, but I think your opening bids have caused me to elevate it slightly. I don't think it's a 6. I think the construction is a little clunky. I think there's a lot for me to enjoy, including some stuff that maybe I only found enjoyable. So I'm going to go 5.5 for the Archons. I don't think it reaches that high strata of a 6 or a 7, but I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in there, and it'll probably end up being one of my favorite episodes the more I think about it. It's just, there's a lot to chew on there, and it's not an easy first meal. I think I probably need to let it sit with me a little while. Space Seed, which I cannot separate intrinsically from the Wrath of Khan, obviously, no one really should. Space Seed is for me a 7. even with the things that we've just been talking about, because of the bricks, the foundation it leads to, this energizing update years later that they absolutely nailed with Space Battles and James Horner and Nicholas Meyer. I don't know if we'll see a more formidable villain across the entire 3-season run, but I would have given him an Emmy, special guest star in a hour-long drama series. I just felt like you can't take your eyes off him when he's on screen. And it's just a pure magnetic pull. Like you want him to, you don't want him to succeed and win, but you want to see him give as good as Kirk and the crew can take.
And he does.
And so it's like a great heavyweight fight, right? And so the more punches he throws, you want our guys to get up off the mat and swing some more there. So you can't penetrate this defense. So yeah, that's a 7 for me on Space Seed, because it grew into one heck of a tree down the road.
Lord Uther?
Return of the Archons was the first time I didn't mind if a Star Trek episode actually ended. I gotta be honest. So I'm gonna be generous at a 4, and I think that might be generous for me. I just really struggled with the episode, but I do like, again, the big 3 get me through that episode. It had its moments. I like the opening with Sulu. I like putting another crewman in danger like that and kind of setting up the episode. So, for me, I'll go 4 out of 7. Space Seed easily 7 out of 7. I might even hit warp 9.9 with this episode. It was that good because, again, we can tie it to Wrath of Khan. And may I say this, and I'll say it anyway, whether you want to hear it or not. At least neither of you attached it to that dysentery poop fest that was Star Trek Into Darkness, because it was, my friends, Into Darkness, like the movie never should have been made, existed, anything. You never referenced that Khan. I win. None of your arguments ever about that movie being even halfway decent can even be valid now, because you didn't once even reference that movie, because we know the only true Khan, the only true sequel to this whole thing is Wrath of Khan. And to me, the second best villain that Kirk ever went up against was Chang. Like, that's the only other villain that I feel might be on Khan's level in terms of who Kirk winds up going up against. So,
not Krug?
That's oh man, that's kind of good too. Chang. I'm gonna go Chang. But still,
Lord
I'm not
Uther,
talking to you about no.
No, Lord Uther, what is the in Strange New Worlds, what is the agency that handles time travel or other timelines? I forget the name.
Oh, that's UrzaMaster's realm. That's the Space Police, isn't it, or something like that?
Temporal
Police Force.
Temporal Investigations.
They just passed me a note, Lord Uther, that says that in several other concurrent timelines to this one on this broadcast, we do bring up Benedict Cumberbatch's scintillating performance in the Kelvin timeline. Star Trek. Yeah, that is happening in other timelines concurrently, so we will get our chance to defend that when the time comes.
That was a nice try, but it doesn't work.
Okay.
And so, I would give The Return of the Archons a solid 5. I enjoyed the episode, but the structure left a lot to be desired. I feel like if ever one was to remaster and maybe remake that episode, if it were possible, if there's anything left on the cutting room floor that could make it better, that is one I would love to see elevated. I think there's about 20 minutes of content missing from it that would make it a flawless episode of Star Trek. But as it sits, 5 out of 7 warp cores. Space Seed, it's a 7 out of 7. I mean, even for the problems I think that it does have, I can't give it anything less. And I think tying it to Star Trek 2 only elevates it. I will say, as a huge Benedict Cumberbatch fan, and I did actually enjoy the Kelvin Star Trek movies for what they were, but they are just that. They are movies that are. They are not Star Trek. I did not care for Uhura in those movies. I did not care for the flip-flop of Spock yelling Khan instead of Kirk. I didn't care for Benedict Cumberbatch being so scrawny and just like a chess genius instead of like a genetically manipulated human being should be physically and mentally exceptional. Nothing against Benedict Cumberbatch. I think he's a decent looking guy and all that, but is definitely not a physical specimen by any stretch of the imagination. Now, if you had cast I'm trying to think of somebody who could do it, and I don't want to say The Rock.
I said that on purpose because he's in everything like that. But yeah.
But I think if you could find somebody who is in like a peak physical condition, like Ricardo Montalban was at the time, and also somebody with superb acting chops,
Gary Oldman.
Gary Oldman, yes, Gary Oldman. Now today, 2023. Honestly, Viggo Mortensen of the era of Lord of the Rings. Could have maybe done it. I could see that because he was in great shape. He had a good look. He was distinguished. He was an elder statesman-ish at the time. Probably, but I think he was in his 30s-ish. That would be one of the actors that I think could potentially have pulled off a Khan reboot. But I think you cannot. You really cannot recast Khan after seeing Ricardo Montalban play him not only in Space Seed but in Wrath of Khan, and that's this episode. This movie will forever be timeless because that is the chemistry between him and Kirk was so strong that they didn't even have to be in the same room together at all during the filming of the movie to make it successful.
And I think I didn't know that until I heard this today because and by the way, everyone, that's what we bring to you. Are pieces like that. I did not know that at no point did they interact that way, which we've talked about before. That just the acting mattered in that situation. I mean, it mattered that they weren't even in the same room, or even like you said, their detective filming at the same time or whatever. Like that's pretty amazing that they could pull off the emotional feels and the punches that they did, and they weren't even near each other filming within the same time period. It's amazing. Oh, one more question that I have was, so I've read multiple things on the internets about this. Was Ricardo Montalban really in that good of shape? Because I've heard that his musculature, that sometimes it was prosthetics, but I heard other times that he really was like that muscular. Do you know, Detective Conklin, using your superior detective skills and your investigative mode, do you know what's true about that?
Sometimes celebrities are dogged by persistent rumors spread through jealousy, rivals, the gossip rags, and there are Richard Gere comes to mind if you know a few urban legends. But Ricardo Montalban has forcefully denied any instance of plastic pecs, and says that when you saw him, he was 100% pure south of the border. So that was, yes.
How old was he at that time?
That was and again, they changed him to a Sikh from the original Nordic configuration. So
what I find interesting, who would you cast if you were going to do a proper reboot of not just Wrath of Khan, but say you were going to do a Space Seed and then a follow-up Wrath of Khan? Who would you cast? If you could cast Kirk, let's just say just Kirk and Khan, those two.
Jude Law as Kirk and Jason Statham as Khan.
I could actually see that. I mean, if I'm being honest, mechanic Jason Statham, I can get behind it.
Yes, and Expendables 4, Jason Statham, and Meg 2, Jason Statham.
Oh
Oh,
my!
oh my, yes.
I don't. Go ahead, Urza. Who? By the way, Montalban was 60 when he made that, which I guess he could have been in that kind of shape because Schwarzenegger's always in Stallone. Well, they might be using a little bit of TRT to stay in the kind of shape that they're in, but Montalban could have been in that good of shape. Urza, who would you cast? Because I honestly will not be able to answer this question, so I'm just so stuck on those two guys.
Chris Evans as Kirk, and I struggle with Khan greatly, but
JCVD.
Ooh.
Muscles from Brussels.
If I could get Street Fighter Jean-Claude Van Damme and Captain America 2 Chris Evans, that would be the matchup. Maybe Sebastian Stan. If I'm Disney and I'm recasting this,
man.
Sebastian Stan as Khan and Chris Evans as Kirk.
I love Chris Evans. That is a great. That is so.
And if
wonderful.
we want to do age appropriate Khan for the sequel, Jack Palance. He can do push-ups one handed. He's right there ready for us. I mean,
I was thinking Dick Van Dyke maybe.
He tangled with the
Jack
Joker.
Palance is still alive.
No,
I would think. Oh, okay. I was going to say that would be pretty amazing if he was, but yeah. Well, Dick Van Dyke's still alive.
Yeah, and looking
95.
decent for what 99 or something.
Yes.
he's a senior, but he's an active senior. So.
Yes,
and if only we knew somebody in Disney casting who could help make this movie happen. I am all for the Warp Core podcast. You heard it here first. We would be happy to remake Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan for Disney.
Yeah.
Again. And we will do it way better than J.J. Abrams could ever dream.
Oh, my. Well, on that note.
Uther, do you have a recasting or should we take us out?
You should take us out because, the only casting I could see is myself as James T. Kirk and Detective Conklin as Khan. And I don't think anyone wants to see these two old guys have some kind of a mental sparring match with extremely, strong warships at our beck and call. So.
Can we get Nick Cage in there? I mean, he's doing interesting work. Can we just work him late stage Nicolas Cage? So
who, what, when, where, how. With that, we will leave you with a very vigorous Star Trek 2/Space Seed. Live long and prosper.
Oh,